You give. You listen. You forgive. And somehow you still leave every conversation feeling smaller, emptier, less alive than before. It's not just the exhaustion after an argument. It's the kind of tiredness that sinks into your bones, the kind that makes you question whether you even recognize yourself anymore. Because every time you try to explain, you end up apologizing. Every time you try to stand up for yourself, you end up doubting if you're overreacting. And every time you try to love, you end up bleeding yourself dry. This is the silent breaking point, the place where the empath begins to wonder, why does my compassion always feel like a burden? It's a question too many people carry silently, and if you've carried it too, you know how invisible it feels. No one praises you for surviving constant emotional erosion. No one sees the way your trust is used like currency in a game you never agreed to play. But here is the truth. What you're experiencing isn't random. It isn't just bad luck in relationships. It's a psychological dynamic that repeats itself over and over until you recognize it for what it is. Because in this dynamic, empathy isn't met with appreciation. It's treated like opportunity. Your ability to understand becomes their permission to exploit. Your forgiveness becomes their safety net. Your silence becomes their proof of victory. And it happens so gradually, so subtly, that you don't even notice the shift. At first, you believe you're just being patient, kind, and understanding. But slowly, you realize that understanding has turned into overlooking, that patience has turned into self-erasure, that kindness has become the very chain around your neck. The result is a kind of invisible suffering, a suffering that doesn't leave scars anyone else can see, but leaves you questioning everything, your worth, your instincts, even your sanity. This is why so many empaths end up in cycles with narcissists, because what begins as giving love becomes the very thing that empties them. And yet, for the longest time, you tell yourself, maybe it's me. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe if I just give a little more, explain a little better, or forgive one more time, things will change. But they don't. They never do. Because what you're caught in isn't a misunderstanding. It's a structure, a pattern, a dynamic that thrives as long as you don't see it clearly. This is why the breaking point is so silent. Not because you don't feel the pain, but because you've been conditioned to swallow it, to absorb it, to smile through it, until one day you realize you're not smiling anymore, you're just surviving. And this is where the journey begins, not in a moment of rage or confrontation, but in the quiet recognition that something is deeply wrong, that the rules you've been living by, the rules of endless giving, endless understanding, and endless forgiveness were never meant to protect you. They were meant to keep you compliant. The silence of this breaking point is not weakness. It's the seed of awareness. It's the moment before the shift, the pause before you learn to see what's really happening. Because what feels like weakness is actually the first flicker of clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, cannot be undone. The empath's exhaustion is not proof of failure, it is proof that something inside of you is refusing to die. That even when you feel hollow, there's a part of you that still whispers, "This isn't right. This isn't love. There has to be more than this." And that whisper is the first sign that you are not broken. You are waking up. This is where the journey of this video begins, with the recognition that what you have lived through is not simply personal misfortune. It is a repeating psychological pattern, a pattern that countless empaths across the world have lived through, often silently, believing they are alone. But you are not alone. And as we continue, you'll see why this pattern repeats, how it sustains itself, and most importantly, how it begins to collapse the moment you recognize the truth. Because the breaking point is not the end, it is the doorway. And once you step through, everything changes.
If empathy is a gift, why does it so often feel like a curse? You're told it's your strength, the ability to sense what others feel, to offer compassion, to step into their perspective. And yet somehow, that very strength has become the reason you feel drained, used, and unseen. This is the paradox of empathy. The very trait that makes you valuable also makes you vulnerable. To a narcissist, your empathy isn't kindness, it's opportunity. It signals that you will bend, that you will forgive, that you will absorb more than most people ever would. And when someone is built on the need to control, manipulate, or feed their fragile sense of self, your empathy becomes their perfect target. But the story doesn't begin with the narcissist. It begins much earlier, with you. For many empaths, the roots of this vulnerability are planted in childhood. If you grew up in an environment where love was conditional, where your emotions weren't fully acknowledged, or where your worth seemed tied to how much you gave to others, you learned a dangerous lesson. To be loved, I must give more than I receive. That lesson buries itself deep. It becomes instinct. You walk into every relationship already primed to overextend, to absorb, to repair. You think of it as kindness, but psychologically it's survival. Because somewhere inside you, the child you once were is still trying to earn the love they never fully received. And narcissists, they sense this. Maybe not consciously, but instinctively. They recognize in you the willingness to give, to explain, to justify, to forgive, and they exploit it. This is why empathy begins to feel like a trap, because the part of you that longs to connect is the very part that keeps you stuck. Your compassion becomes the rope you hand over, and slowly it's tied around you. But here's the truth, most empaths don't realize it first. You're not trapped because you care. You're trapped because you were taught to confuse self-abandonment with love. You were taught that sacrifice equals connection, that silence equals peace, that boundaries equal rejection. This is not empathy. This is conditioning. And once you see the difference, the weight begins to lift. Because genuine empathy is never meant to erase you. It's not supposed to demand that you carry every burden, excuse every cruelty, or silence your own needs. Real empathy connects. It doesn't consume. The trap only exists when empathy is weaponized, and narcissists have perfected the art of that weaponization. They twist your compassion into compliance. They exploit your forgiveness as permission. They manipulate your understanding until you begin to doubt your own reality. And yet the more this happens, the more you blame yourself. You tell yourself you're too sensitive, too emotional, too needy. But in reality, you're not too much. You've simply been paired with someone who takes and takes without giving. Recognizing this is the first step toward freedom. Because once you understand that the pain you feel isn't random, that it's the product of a psychological mechanism, you stop blaming yourself and start seeing the structure. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begin asking, "Why does this dynamic exist at all?" And that question changes everything. Because when you see the mechanism, you're no longer just reacting, you're observing. And observation is the first crack in the cycle. Empathy feels like a curse only when it's unchecked, unbalanced, and unprotected. When it's guarded by self-awareness, boundaries, and self-respect, it becomes what it was always meant to be, a strength. The challenge is in making that shift, from overgiving to balanced giving, from self-erasure to self-recognition, from confusing survival with love to understanding that love never requires you to disappear. And this realization, though painful, is liberating. Because once you see that your empathy is not the problem, that the problem is how it's been exploited, you reclaim the power to change how you use it. You reclaim the right to say no, to step back, to recognize when understanding has become enabling. This is how the trap begins to break, not by hardening your heart, not by losing your compassion, but by learning to direct it wisely, toward people who value it, and toward yourself most of all. This shift matters because in the next stage of the journey, the focus moves from your empathy to the narcissist's language. Because just as you've been conditioned to give, they've been conditioned to control. And once you see their language for what it is, everything begins to change. Narcissists don't argue. They train. Every word, every silence, every gesture has a purpose, to bend you toward compliance. And if you've ever walked away from a conversation with them feeling confused, guilty, or doubting yourself, that's not an accident. That's the design. Because narcissists don't speak the way most people do. They have their own language, a language of control. And if you don't know how to recognize it, you end up learning it without realizing, one subtle exchange at a time. Think about the way they twist your words. You try to explain how you feel, and suddenly you're accused of being too sensitive, too dramatic, too demanding. That's gaslighting, the most famous word in their vocabulary. But it's only one part of their grammar. There's also selective silence, withholding attention, withdrawing affection, leaving you in an anxious limbo until you chase after them. They don't need to raise their voice to dominate. All they need is the threat of disconnection. Then there's projection, accusing you of the very thing they're doing. They cheat and they accuse you of disloyalty. They lie and they call you untrustworthy. The goal is not just to deflect responsibility, but to make you defend yourself endlessly until you forget what the original issue even was. And perhaps the most insidious of all, emotional baiting. They say something cruel, knowing you'll react, and once you do, they shift the spotlight on your reaction, not their cruelty. Suddenly, you're apologizing for being upset about the thing they deliberately triggered. When you add these tactics together, what you see isn't random cruelty, it's a system, a structured language of control. And here's the most dangerous part. When you're caught in it, you don't even realize you're being trained. You think you're just trying to resolve conflict, trying to communicate, trying to keep the peace. But every time you explain, defend, or justify, you're being pulled deeper into their script. This is why so many empaths feel like they're going in circles, because they are. The narcissist has already written the play, and you're simply cast in the role of defender, explainer, apologist. But once you recognize this language, everything shifts. Because suddenly you see the pattern. You notice how the silence isn't absence, it's punishment. You notice how the guilt isn't yours, it's projection. You notice how the arguments aren't conversations, they're rehearsals of control. And when you see this, you stop reacting the way they expect. You stop feeding the system. This is the beginning of awakening. Realizing that you're not in chaos, you're in a structure. And structures can be dismantled. For the empath, this realization is both painful and empowering. Painful because you begin to see how many times you were manipulated, how many moments of guilt and confusion were carefully orchestrated. But empowering because you finally understand that it was never about you being too much or too sensitive or not enough. It was about control, always control. And now you're learning the language. The irony is the moment you begin decoding their tactics, the power dynamic shifts because narcissists depend on your confusion. They thrive on your over-explaining, your defending, your endless attempts to prove your goodness. Without your reaction, their language collapses. Think of it this way. Imagine someone shouting in a language you don't understand. At first you panic, you try to guess what they mean, you stumble, you stress. But the moment you learn the words, the fear dissolves. You realize it's not a mystery, it's just a script. And when the empath learns the narcissist's script, something profound happens. They stop being the student and they become the observer. This doesn't mean you engage in the same tactics. It doesn't mean you start playing their game back at them. It means you begin to see the game for what it is. And once you see it, you can choose not to play. The language of control loses its power the moment it's recognized. Silence no longer manipulates you. Guilt no longer binds you. Projection no longer distracts you, because now you see through it. And that's the turning point. Not in confrontation, not in revenge, but in clarity. Because clarity is the one thing a narcissist cannot withstand. This is the moment where the story changes, where the empath is no longer simply reacting, but observing, where confusion turns into recognition, where the silent breaking point begins to transform into strength. And in the next stage, we'll explore exactly what that moment looks like.
The instant you finally recognize the pattern for what it is, that's when everything begins to unravel. They speak, you pause, and for the first time, you don't rush to explain, to justify, or to apologize. You simply notice. It's such a small thing on the surface, a pause, a breath, a gap in the script. But within that silence is a shift so profound that it changes everything. Because up until now, every word from the narcissist has pulled you into reaction. They accuse, you defend. They withdraw, you chase. They twist, you explain. The cycle spins endlessly, fueled by your instinct to restore peace, to clear your name, to prove your love. But in this moment, something breaks. Not in you, but in the pattern. You hear the same words, the same tone, the same familiar manipulation, but instead of being swept into the storm, you step back, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. You watch, you observe, and in that observation, you feel something you haven't felt in a long time. Space. Space to question, space to breathe, space to remember that not every accusation is yours to absorb. This is the moment of recognition, the moment you realize the game only works if you play it. At first, it's disorienting. The silence feels heavy, almost unnatural. You're used to filling it with apologies, explanations, defenses. But as you stay quiet, as you refuse to step into the trap, you feel something stirring inside you, a flicker of control. Because detachment is not indifference, it's clarity. It's the ability to separate what belongs to you from what belongs to them. It's the moment you finally see that the guilt they hand you is theirs, not yours. That the anger they project is theirs, not yours. That the story they've written for you is not the truth of who you are. And once you taste that clarity, you can never unsee it. This is why narcissists fear awareness. Because the second you stop reacting, their tactics lose oxygen. Their script depends on your participation. Without it, their words fall flat. Their silence has no effect. Their power begins to collapse. For the empath, this recognition is both fragile and monumental. Fragile because it's new. It takes strength to resist the old reflex of defending yourself, but monumental because it marks the first step out of the cycle. You are no longer just the character in their story, you are the observer of the story itself. And that changes everything. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with shouting or confrontation. It arrives quietly in the stillness of your own awareness. A pause, a noticing, a refusal to play the role you've been cast in. But that quiet shift is more powerful than any outburst could ever be, because it's not about fighting them, it's about freeing yourself. From this moment forward, every silence you choose, every pause you hold, every instant you refuse to defend your worth becomes a declaration. I see the pattern, and I am no longer bound by it. This is the seed of transformation, the beginning of sovereignty. Narcissists fear one thing more than abandonment: being seen for what they are. For as long as the cycle has lasted, they've relied on your confusion to protect them. Every manipulation, every projection, every calculated silence was a mask, a way to hide their fragility behind control. But the moment you stop reacting, the mask begins to slip. And when it slips, panic sets in. At first, it's subtle. You notice a shift in their tone, a sharper edge in their words. They sense the change, even if you haven't spoken it aloud. The silence you once filled with explanations now lingers, and that silence exposes them. So they escalate. Some will explode in rage, sudden, disproportionate anger designed to shock you back into submission. They raise their voice, slam doors, hurl accusations, anything to remind you of the power they think they hold. And others will retreat into withdrawal, weaponizing distance. They disappear, cut off communication, leave you drowning in anxiety, hoping the anxiety will drive you back into chasing them. And still others will pivot to victimhood, collapsing into tears, telling stories of how misunderstood and mistreated they are. They will beg, plead, even accuse you of cruelty, hoping your empathy will rush back in to rescue them. The strategies may differ, but the purpose is always the same: to restore control, to pull you back into the script, to remind you that they decide the rules of connection, not you. But now you see it differently, because once you've recognized the pattern, their panic no longer confuses you, it reveals them. Their anger isn't power, it's fear. Their withdrawal isn't strength, it's desperation. Their victimhood isn't truth, it's manipulation. You begin to understand something crucial. Narcissistic control isn't built on dominance, it's built on fragility. The entire system depends on you not noticing how afraid they really are. Afraid of exposure, afraid of losing supply, afraid of facing the emptiness that lies beneath the mask. And when you no longer feed that system, when you hold your ground in quiet awareness, you are no longer the one being trained. They are the one unraveling. This is the paradox of the narcissist's panic. The louder they react, the clearer you see. Because in their escalation, they expose the very thing they've worked so hard to conceal. The fact that their power was never real. It was borrowed. It depended on your confusion, your compliance, your silence. Without that, they are forced to confront themselves. And for a narcissist, that confrontation is unbearable. For the empath, this stage is both validating and dangerous. Validating because for the first time you witnessed the collapse of their control. Dangerous because the intensity of their panic can pull you back in if you're not careful. Their rage can trigger fear. Their withdrawal can trigger abandonment wounds. Their victimhood can trigger guilt. This is why awareness matters so deeply, because once you understand that their reaction is not about you, but about their fear of losing control, you no longer personalize it. You no longer see their rage as proof of your fault, but as proof of their unraveling. And that reframing is everything. It doesn't make the panic easier to witness, but it makes it clearer. And clarity is what keeps you grounded. The narcissist's panic is not your responsibility to soothe. It is not your job to calm their rage, chase their silence, or rescue their victimhood. Because the truth is, what they're experiencing is the collapse of their illusion. An illusion they built, and an illusion they must face. And you're stepping out of it. This moment, as tense as it is, marks the turning of the tide. For the first time, the balance of power has shifted, not because you fought harder,
but because you stopped playing. And in the space left by their panic, a new temptation arises. The temptation to use your knowledge of their language against them, to play the game back, to taste the power they once held over you. That temptation is where the next part of this journey begins. When you first recognize the narcissist tactics, it feels like stepping behind the curtain of a long-running performance. For years, they controlled the script, pulling invisible strings to make you question yourself, to keep you reacting, doubting, explaining. And now, you finally see how it works. You see the gaslighting for what it is. You hear the projections as confessions. You feel the manipulations as rehearsed strategies. And with that awareness comes something dangerous: power. Because once you understand their language, you realize you can speak it too. You know which silences cut the deepest. You know which words trigger their insecurities. You know how to mirror their tactics, how to flip the game back onto them. And for the first time, the possibility of retaliation glimmers in your mind. It's tempting. After all the confusion, the nights spent replaying arguments in your head, the shame of believing you were never enough, why not take some of that control back? Why not make them feel the very helplessness they made you feel? The idea is intoxicating. Not because you crave cruelty, but because you crave justice. Revenge feels like balance. To finally watch them squirm, to see their mask shatter, to know they can no longer manipulate you, it's a kind of victory that feels almost irresistible. But here lies the trap. The moment you start playing their game, you step back into their world. The language of manipulation doesn't belong to you. It belongs to them. And once you wield it, you risk becoming entangled in the very cycle you fought so hard to escape. The truth is, the narcissist doesn't fear retaliation. They thrive on it. Any emotional engagement, whether it's anger, revenge, or despair, feeds the dynamic. It proves they still have influence. What terrifies them is not your retaliation, but your indifference. Not your rage, but your clarity. Not your revenge, but your refusal to play. Because real power isn't in beating them at their own game, it's in stepping off the board altogether. And yet this temptation of power serves an important function in your healing. It shows you just how much you've learned. You're no longer confused, no longer blind to the tactics that once ensnared you. You can see the strings, and that awareness alone changes everything. But the deeper lesson is this: knowing the language of the narcissist does not mean you must speak it. It means you finally understand that you don't need to. You don't need to prove your strength through retaliation, because your strength is already evident in your clarity. You don't need to trap them in their own lies, because the truth has already exposed them. You don't need to win, because the game itself was the illusion. Here, the empath faces a choice: to step into the cycle of control or to step beyond it. And this is where individuation begins, where you stop defining yourself by the wounds inflicted on you and start defining yourself by the self you are reclaiming. The temptation of power is not about them, it's about you. It's about recognizing how close you are to freedom and how easily you could lose it if you confuse revenge with healing. So you pause, you breathe, and you realize that the greatest revenge is not in hurting them back, but in no longer needing to. Because the narcissist's greatest fear is not your anger, it's your absence. Not your retaliation, it's your evolution. Not your power over them, it's your decision to rise beyond them. And when you choose that path, when you step away from the game entirely, you unlock a kind of power they can never touch. A power rooted not in control, but in clarity, not in manipulation, but in freedom. The temptation of power is the final test before transformation. To pass it, you don't need to fight harder. You need to walk away stronger. And as you do, you begin to feel something new, something fragile, but undeniable. A faint glimpse of peace.
What if the greatest shift is not in what you say, but in what you no longer respond to? For so long, you were trained to explain yourself. Every silence felt like a threat. Every accusation pulled you into defense. Every manipulation demanded that you prove, clarify, justify. It was as if your worth depended on keeping the peace, on showing them you were good enough. But now, something has changed. You've learned their language, seen their patterns, and felt the pull of power. You know how to fight back, but you also know fighting keeps you in the game. And so for the first time, you experiment with something new. Silence. Not the silence they used to punish you with, not the cold withdrawal meant to make you chase after them. This is a different kind of silence. It's not absence, it's presence. It's the decision not to pour your energy into an endless void. It's the refusal to explain what no longer requires justification. It's the choice to protect your peace rather than defend your innocence. This silence is not weakness. It's not avoidance. It's sovereignty. Because when you stop responding, when you stop feeding the endless cycle of push and pull, you create space. And in that space, something remarkable happens. You begin to hear yourself again. The constant noise of their accusations and demands once drowned out your own voice. But now, in the quiet you've created, your own thoughts begin to emerge with clarity. You notice the weight lifting from your body when you don't answer every provocation. You feel the calm that comes from no longer carrying conversations designed only to confuse you. And the narcissist notices it too. They may rage, they may escalate, they may throw everything they can at you to break the silence, because silence terrifies them. It reveals the hollowness of their tactics. It shows them that the language they relied on no longer controls you. And yet, you don't need to announce this victory. You don't need to declare, "I'm stronger now." Your silence says it for you. Integration means you no longer live in reaction. You don't seek revenge, but you don't seek approval either. You don't shrink, but you don't fight on their terms. You begin to understand that true fluency in their language isn't about speaking it, it's about transcending it. Think about it. The most powerful boundaries are often the quietest ones. Not a dramatic speech, but a calm no. Not an angry rebuttal, but a refusal to engage. Not a war of words, but the serenity of knowing you don't owe anyone an explanation for who you are. This shift is not easy. In fact, it feels uncomfortable at first. Silence can feel like neglecting yourself, like you're letting them win. But slowly, you realize the opposite is true. Every time you hold your silence, every time you decline to justify, every time you protect your peace, you win. And something deeper takes root. Integration. Because healing isn't about erasing the empath or denying your sensitivity. It's about owning it differently. It's about realizing your empathy no longer makes you vulnerable, it makes you discerning. It's about reclaiming your compassion as a choice, not a compulsion. It's about giving without depletion, connecting without losing yourself. You integrate what you've learned not as a weapon, but as wisdom. You see the game, and you no longer play. You hear the bait, and you no longer bite. You recognize the manipulation, and you simply let it pass without absorbing it. This is the quiet power of detachment. Not disconnection from life, but disconnection from the cycle that once held you captive. And in this silence, you begin to feel something rare. an internal stability that no external chaos can shake. Because when you no longer need to respond, you no longer need their validation. And when you no longer need their validation, you are finally free. This is what integration looks like. Not the absence of empathy, but the presence of boundaries. Not the loss of self, but the return of self. Not speaking their language, but mastering your own. And as you settle into this silence, you realize the transformation is nearly complete. What began as exhaustion has become clarity. What once felt like a curse now feels like strength. What once consumed you has now released you. And ahead lies the final step, the moment when silence becomes not just a boundary, but a foundation. The moment when you no longer define yourself by the narcissist at all. The moment you meet the sovereign self. The real victory is not in defeating them. It's in never needing their game again. For so long, your life felt like an endless reaction. You measured yourself through their eyes, through their approval, through the constant battle of proving and defending. Every argument, every silence, every manipulation pulled you deeper into their orbit. But now something fundamentally has shifted. You've seen the cycle. You've felt the temptation of power. You've learned the strength of silence. And in that journey, you've uncovered something far greater than survival. You've uncovered yourself. This is the sovereign self. It is not the version of you that bends to please, nor the version that retaliates to hurt. It is not defined by wounds or by battles, not even by the identity of empath or survivor. The sovereign self is who you were before the cycle began and who you are after you step out of it. It is the part of you that knows you are enough without needing proof. The part that loves without collapsing into self-sacrifice. The part that speaks not to convince, but to express. The part that rests in its own clarity, even when the world demands explanation. Sovereignty does not mean you never feel pain again. It does not mean you never doubt or never stumble. It means that pain no longer defines your choices. Doubt no longer dictates your worth. Stumbles no longer erase your progress. It means you are no longer trapped in someone else's script. You are the author now. And here lies the quiet revolution. The narcissist no longer matters. Their language, their games, their attempts to control, they may still exist, but they no longer bind you. Because sovereignty isn't about controlling them, it's about reclaiming yourself. Think of what this means in your life. The conversations that once drained you now feel optional. The manipulations that once disoriented you now feel transparent. The approval you once begged for now feels irrelevant. And with this clarity comes something even more profound. Freedom to love differently. Because the sovereign self does not stop loving. It does not harden into coldness or close its heart in fear. Instead, it loves with discernment. It loves without erasing itself. It loves from abundance, not from hunger. This is the transformation. What began as exhaustion, as the quiet suffering of giving too much, has led you here, to the recognition that your empathy is not a curse, but a gift. When it is anchored in sovereignty, now when you give, you choose. When you listen, you discern. When you forgive, you do so without sacrificing your boundaries. And when you walk away, you do so without guilt. The narcissist may never change. They may never see what you've seen, never grow in the way you have grown, but that no longer matters. Their journey is not yours to carry. Your victory is not in their downfall, it is in your rise. And so you stand at the end of this path, not broken, not hardened, but whole. You no longer need to prove yourself. You no longer need to fix anyone. You no longer need to play. Because the sovereign self does not live in reaction. It lives in creation. It builds, it shapes, it expands. It chooses connections that nourish rather than drain. It builds a life that reflects who you are, not who someone else demanded you be.
This is where the story ends. Not with revenge, not with collapse, but with return. The return to yourself. And if you listen closely, you can feel it, the quiet strength of a life that is finally yours. Because the greatest power was never in learning their language. It was in remembering your own.